Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Bryan. I hope you're going to enjoy this podcast today. Today, we have a special guest on, Johnny Ramirez. He's one of my many mentors back in the day. You know, during high school, we've interacted a lot. During when I started college and doing a lot of advocacy work, and he's now and off doing more and new things like gathering more knowledge to effectively work in the community. Just a quick thing before I get started with introducing our guests. Just remember, if you like and subscribe, you know, I've done it a lot at the back end, you know, doing the whole YouTube spiel, but I'm going to try to do it in the very beginning. Just let you know, if you like what you see, please subscribe. So I'll let Johnny take it away. Did I miss anything? I feel like this is the first. Have you ever been on a radio program or a podcast before? You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. I have been on a few podcasts. As I think we've shifted to the pandemic, I've had like a few either Zoom interviews or podcast opportunities to share and stuff. So yeah, thank you, Bryan. So my name is Johnny Carlos Remirez. In my community work of over 20 years as a youth organizer, community empowerment worker, I would say my nickname in neighborhoods has been Johnny Rocket Can't Stop It. And I could talk a little bit more about how that came about doing hip hop intervention work. Mm-hmm. But I guess I also have to acknowledge the fact that I also go by Dr. Johnny Carlos Remirez, University of Denver Critical Race and Ethnic Studies professor. The last 2 years, as I've shifted from my work in LA, I've been here in the Denver area, building with community, continuing to do youth participatory action research, continuing to work with grassroots organizations that are committed to healing, to social justice. I think that really just reflects my identity as an activist scholar. So yeah, no, I'm really blessed to be here. Me and Bryan have gone back, through the years. When I think about my work with Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, but I think for me it was in this real looking at how can we start to build coalitions within our different communities in LA, because there isn't just one LA.
Yeah.
And I think I grew as an organizer, I grew as a mentor in that work, and it's just really good to like look back and be like, wow, like we've been our relationship has easily been like 6 years plus.
Yeah.
Maybe even closer to 10 now.
Yeah, and it's weird seeing that kind of time flow over time. I guess the pandemic kind of put everything in perspective. Like really kind of contextualizing like everything we've done up until this point. And then I think because the way things are happening through this pandemic, it's almost like this public reckoning of like what we've been fighting for. Now people are like opening their eyes saying like, you know what, why haven't I like seen this in our communities? And like the work that we've done is like, we've been trying to tell you, we've been saying these things were important. And then it took a pandemic to like kind of put things in perspective, and I mentioned this before with my anime co-host. It's like, it's almost as if it's like 2020 is the year that, we're living the social unrest of the 60s. And then we're also dealing with a pandemic of like the last century. And then we're dealing with economic crisis all at the same time, Oh, wait, Johnny? Hello? Oh no. Hello?
Hello. We lost each other a little bit, and then I came back.
Yeah. We lost each other a little bit. We just got back. Everything good?
Yeah. No, somehow my Wi-Fi jumped onto another network.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My apologies. Pandemic. Once again, struggles of relying on Zoom.
I know. My point earlier was just saying it's like it almost feels as if we're having a public reckoning of like so many things at once. And I was saying earlier that 2020 is like it's basically we're condensing the social struggles of the 60s and the 70s, and we're condensing economic crises of like this Great Depression, and then having a pandemic of like 100 years ago, all in 1 year, and it's almost as if we need to think quickly for solutions in the community, and that's something that I feel the work that we do is like we're very hyper aware of things that can affect the community and ways to solve it. And one of the things that I've talked about before is that like different communities have different issues and like different ways of addressing those issues. And me living in LA, and you mentioned this before, is that LA is more than just downtown LA or like the metropolitan area.
Right.
LA can be East LA, Highland Park, the San Gabriel Valley, the San Fernando Valley,
The
like
West Side.
the
Yep.
West Side, yeah, and South Central, and it also could encompass Long Beach, San Pedro. It's like it's more than just what you see in the Hollywood movies, where it's like downtown focused, and
Right.
and something that kind of like I've been kind of grappling with is that what may work in places like Highland Park and like or in these areas may not necessarily work in other areas, like just by the sheer fact that they may not be the same resources. Each city does not have the same resources, whether that's either gentrification or lack of people in permanent housing. Like one of our big conversations later is about gentrification and people leaving a populated area. My question that I want to address now is that you've were born and raised in LA, right? Or like within the LA area.
Yeah.
And you're now in Denver, Colorado. Like, do you see that there's any differences or similarities? Like, do you think that you could say there's some stuff that you took away from LA and brought back to Denver that worked or didn't work?
Yeah, no, I think I would say that I guess as a critical race scholar too, I would say that all my lived experiences and experiential knowledge contribute to some form of resource or some form of lenses that allows me to kind of articulate and understand the world around me. So I think coming into Denver, recognizing that for the demographics, the way that Denver's laid out and its history is a bit different than LA. But at the same time, I think that there is some connections and there is some similarity. So I think the one thing that's really been my strength in coming is being a trained organizer, doing youth work and community organizing work for over 20 years is the first number one thing that we get trained right in our work is to listen, to critically listen and listen to folks' stories, to listen to the community. Like, don't try to force your perspectives when you're the new person in the hood. When you're like that person that's coming as an outsider. And I've heard from so many Denver activists that it's really refreshing to even come in, as much as I'm learning to build trust and folks are getting to know who I am, but just being somebody that's been outside of the community, walking in to these activist circles and to meeting with residents, it's like my perspectives and my observations become really powerful, because sometimes I pick up on things that folks that are just, it's very normalized for them. They live it every day, they see it. I remember with the young folks, we did this youth participatory action research project that was looking at the social toxins within their community. And I think the biggest takeaway that the young folks had was looking at this area called Swansea, which is kind of this working class industrial type area. And when I took them there, the idea was for us to look at this freeway that was right next to an elementary school. And I was showing them some pictures of the way that West Adams, in downtown LA, right there in Vermont, exit the 10 in Vermont, the high school's right next to the freeway. So you're talking about air pollution, you're talking about traffic pollution. I mean, that's like a real reality that there's going to be health impacts, negative health impacts that are going to happen from this. And historically, it comes from environmental racism. As we were out there mapping that area, they're taking pictures, and one of the youth is like, oh shit, look at what I caught in this picture. And on the other side, like if you looked at the freeway in the background, right above, like in the skyline of the freeway, is the big Purina dog food plant. It's one of the largest Purina dog food plants. And that in itself presents a lot of pollution and the smell of the food in the air and everything. And I think that moment, a lot of the young people were like, we never thought about this. We never thought about how these entities in our communities was impacting us. So I'm seeing me being a little bit of the new guy that's coming in as a strength, because I'm helping some of community folks, especially our youth, unpack kind of what's going on. And I would say one thing that's been very different, I think, and that I'm taking away is watching communities that have experienced gentrification on steroids, meaning that they had a lot of what we know the process of gentrification. There's always a move to rebrand. So one of the things that they did out here was starting to have meetings and planning meetings, community planning meetings, where they passed, legislations to start changing and rebranding these areas about 10 years before the residents and the activism started to really check the gentrification that happened. And because they were able to rebrand, and then the market started flooding in, and everybody started to, as we talk about in gentrification, it's almost like the hood lottery. A lot of families see their house increase to 5-fold than what they bought it at. So they sell it for their retirement, or they sell it to then move on to another area and, and take the value with them. But that whole process started because it was a whole rebranding. And a lot of folks were just like, you know what, we were going through urban colonialism and not even know it. That folks were already in these governing bodies were already renaming the communities that we lived in without us even knowing it, so that when they flew it on the market, they could totally rebrand it and really push the gentrification. And the Chicano community here that had Corky Gonzalez, the Crusade for Justice, that was really active in the 60s, 70s, and still now to an extent, but at its peak in the 60s and 70s, that whole North Side neighborhood is probably about 80% gentrified already. Yeah. Because they call it the Heights, because they went in and renamed it. And I'm going to give you the name of it. It was called North Side, but a Chicano teatro group here called Su Teatro did a whole play about how that went down. And they did it present day, and then they would do flashbacks and then go back to when it was an Italian Mexican-American neighborhood and how they fought for a pool there at the park, and what happens when the cops came and it became a communal uprising, and the cops brutalized all the youth and families for demanding for a public pool that the city promised. It was crazy. So yeah, I think I bring a lot of that gentrification feel of my work in downtown, and that feeling of forced removal. And what does it feel like when you have heightened police surveillance, all that? I think I had the lens and the language to really build with these young folks that are really struggling, because the more they've been pushed out of their neighborhood, now as a youth intervention worker, we've got to drive farther to get to them. And we have limited staff. They can't just take the bus to come to our office. It just presents a lot of challenges when folks are kind of decentralized from their resources.
Right. And you brought up a good point, and kind of one of my fears of the early talks of communities outside of Minneapolis wanting to address the issue when the George Floyd event happened. And as much as a lot of their ideas are coming from a place of love and coming from a place of restorative justice, is Oregon and Washington are not the same places as Minneapolis, and it's not a one-to-one. And my hope, if they do decide, to expand or go out there, is that they be very tactful, and what you said is try to address it on a community level, not on some kind of oh, we have the model, let's apply the model to our community, and it's something that I've learned from high school on to college and now as an adult is thinking, I had this naive notion. It's oh yeah, just follow the model. But that's not necessarily the case. Even if it's a different school within the same district, there is different styles, and people do things differently, do things differently. And there's politics, and there's things that kind of coincide, and and something that not many people understand about the nonprofit industrial complex that I've that we've taught, that I don't know if we talked with you about, but I've talked to what my coworkers about, is just that, there's this idea that if we follow the model, everything would be okay. But like, if we follow that logic, and a community doesn't have those same resources, do not have the same backing, and do not have the same, people that are passionate about doing the work, the ends, like the plan doesn't match up. It's not going to work out,
Right.
And so we got to meet communities at where they're at,
Exactly.
and identify and then move forward, because if that work does not get done first, nothing gets done.
Yeah, no, totally. And Brian, I think you're hitting something too, is like, along with that meeting with community where they're at, and how there's different dynamics and politics at each community and each spot that you're going to do the work, then it comes down to one of our core values in the work is relationship building and trust. And that doesn't come over time. And I think that's when you have to be, boots on the ground, talking to parents, talking to teachers, knocking on doors, spending that time to really learn about the issues, finding and identifying existing leaders. I mean, this idea, like, where the nonprofit industrial complex, when that model gets lost, is doing that one shoe fit all type of approach, which already makes our educational system and our schools disenfranchise us. It's the reason why you can never find equity in that model, because some folks have more resources and have a history of being able to push things to a certain extent. Then there's areas that are maybe at the very beginning of being developed and need way more foundation. Across the board, what we're also talking about is sustainability. The fact that a lot of time in industrial, it's very hard to get funding in a nonprofit industrial model to really say it's going to take us about a good 3 to 5 years to actually do our homework, to do research, to actually understand the dynamics, to strategically organize something to move something forward. Yeah. And usually our communities are so much under-resourced. There could be moments of crisis where we've got to quickly, like you said, we've got to quickly problem solve, frame something, and move something. But that in itself is the reason why sometimes we're always on the catch up. We're not on the proactive side, because it's hard to get funding to say we're going to go and we're going to build that relationship, and we're going to look at it across the board, so that when we do almost, we do make that plan of action, it's coming from this very informed, strategic spot. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier too. As folks that do this work, we can understand that when communities and when folks really get upset, like in this historical moment, they're quick to demand, like, we want this now. But then the question is, well, what are your demands and what do you want? And what is the politics? Like, what's the dynamic that's going on? And are we strategic about that demand? Exactly.
And something that I feel very, I wouldn't say disenfranchised, but kind of frustrated with this kind of like nonprofit kind of sphere is that, sometimes funding can be corporate funding. And like, and as much as like the money flows and people are getting paid and stuff like that, sometimes the ask, and there's nothing wrong about getting money from Bank of America, and there's nothing necessarily wrong too much about getting money from SoCal Edison. And I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble on naming people, but it's the thing is, sometimes they ask certain things that the community doesn't necessarily need, or like the community doesn't necessarily find as important, and it doesn't meet them in the needs that they want, And granted, sometimes there's cases where that works out, like they're a high school that has a freeway going alongside it and gets environmental activism through an energy company, or Bank of America does financial help for immigrant youth. Sometimes that happens, but in a case where if we want to address issues like gentrification, or if we want to address issues of having students talk about their immigrant stories to address and have a broader image of immigration in the community, like sometimes those fundings don't line up, and like they could say it's like, oh well, we're not here to make immigrant stories, like we're going to pull our funding. You're not following the track. And and I think my hope is that like funding through nonprofit is not just a corporate thing, but it can be a community-led thing. It could be like the city investing in it, or local community like entrepreneurs be like, oh, you know what, maybe I can commit even like $50 a month or something to keep this kind of program going, to make sure that there's food in the pantry, or to make sure that so it feels more community led than like it has to be coming through a corporate. Do you
Oh
kind of
yeah,
see where
no,
I'm
I
coming
totally
at?
see
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Through the years, we know, especially that I would say that I've been blessed that in the three major youth organizations that I've worked with have always had a very unapologetic stance for social justice. And we know with funding, whether it's standing up for undocumented folks, whether it was like the Pico Youth and Family Center in Santa Monica's Pico neighborhood, where we stood up for the youth of color that were being, criminalized and stuff, and we were standing up for gentrification, like. And the Youth Justice Coalition, again, working with system-impacted youth and their families, challenging all these stigma. There was funders and city officials that would keep us like 100 feet away, that would never fund and touch and support the work that we did, because we were calling out the system, systemic forms of racism, whiteness, colonialism, colonization, basically trying to name those systems of oppression. And I think what we've learned through the years, and I know there's a big movement that's revolving around what they call social entrepreneurship, or how is there a way to find needs or ways to create economic development and generate resources on one side of the organization, and then on the other side of the organization, then you have the program, the support services, the political advocacy, the organizing, and have one bring resources into the other. And probably the closest model to that, even though they do stay away from political activism, would be Homeboy Industries. They have like the Homegirl Cafe, they have the t-shirt making, they have the tortilla chips making, and they have all their clothing and gear and all that. All that money then goes right into funding all their case management, data, services, hiring folks, like all that. Tia Chuchas in the San Fernando Valley, Tia Chuchas is that model. So they'll sell books. Luis Rodriguez, the founder, he'll go and speak and use honorariums. They'll hire young people. They'll do community events where they have food vendors and everything, and then they kind of charge by organizing it like event planners. But they're all about using a part of their organization and their space to generate revenue, and then have that funding come right into their culture, their cultural identity work, their community empowerment work. So you're right. It's like, where can we go in our community and find these folks that want to take those skills of developing a market or to generate revenues that would be healthy or create opportunity in our community, and at the same time have those things fund the activist work, the community building work. Because at some point, I really do feel the bust in, depending on corporations or even government grants, is at some point they're going to cut it off.
Right.
None of that has ever been sustainable. In fact, we know from the nonprofit industrial complex, by definition, it rose and came about because it took the money that we were pressing for government to provide social and public services. It basically took it out of their hands and put it in these nonprofits, so it can almost be one step closer to being privatized. So yeah, like we're at a moment where we've got to start to have all these conversations and these visions of actually looking at what's beyond that model. Because to me, at some point, neoliberalism will teach us that our fight is going to be for public rights and public access to services, because if we don't watch it, they're getting privatized.
Yeah, and it's on the perspective of like the work that I do. It's like I just want the freedom just to do the work, and not have some BS like, oh, by the way, check out Bank of America, or like, oh, check out like this corporate entity that's like in the Southern California area. It's like, I want my work to stand on its own, to not have like this idea of like, oh, you did this, oh, it's cool and all, but oh, you also got funding through this, and like, what do you think of their politics? It's like, I don't know, I don't follow. It's like they just give us the money to do the work we do, and to be more free and to just do the work versus having to answer to somebody else.
Right.
Yeah. And so we did brought up a bit about gentrification, and there was something that within I think the news hasn't really picked up, or just like it hasn't really been talked about. But I think Killer Mike brought up a conversation that, you know, there's this idea of re-entrification, and you brought up the idea of like social entrepreneurship, where money and like ownership stays within a community, and like the idea that you know, a lot of folks that grew up in disadvantaged areas says, hey, I want to just get the fuck out of here. You know, I just want to, you know, like get my degree, get everything, and just get out of here. Which, you know, that's good to a degree, but at the same point, it's like, once we leave, who gets to benefit from you leaving, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the idea that once we put these properties on sale, it opens the door for speculators. It opens the door for people that have funds. And what you mentioned, that like, you know, like new style of urban colonialism, where people are just taking up these properties. And instead of that happening, we're having families come back and say like, oh, we want to keep this property because this means something to us. We cut our teeth, we've put our kids through college, and for it to go into someone else's hands, you know, like that's something that we don't want happen, you know. And so I wonder if you have some thoughts on that. And like, I don't know if that's something new that anybody mentioned, but you know.
No, I think you're really laying out, I think, some of the biggest critiques about like when we think of gentrification, because one of the fundamental, I think, perspectives is in it that residents will say is, where was all this investment, and where was all this government support, and where was all this police and everything, and the changing of the parks and all this investment, when 20 years ago this was seen as the hood? No one wanted to be over here. Mm-hmm. This was a depressed by systematically. This area was depressed to have low rent, to basically, to be a low income area with under-resourced schools and limited access to grocery stores and everything. You know, we know the conditions of some of our harder hit neighborhoods of South Central, you know, South LA, you know, parts of East LA, Boyle Heights. I mean, you're talking about generations of poverty.
Right.
And I think like the biggest thing is like, so then this process comes where now folks are seeing this as, again, kind of urban colonialism. They're seeing this as prime real estate, because we know that in that development, the closer you're going to be to center of LA, the more that there's going to be more profits to be made. Mm-hmm. So now folks are seeing value and they come in. And I think it's just the process that happens is just very violent. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the tenets in that is that residents will say is that there's just major over policing in the neighborhood. And they start harassing folks, profiling folks, and they basically start making those families that were suffering during those years, that maybe some of them wanted to get out because of their childhood and growing up was full of maybe gangs, drugs, violence. You know, they're looking for that quote unquote American dream and leaving the neighborhood. But then the sad part is that then the families that did stay, because they didn't have those resources, now everything is being economically uplifted and they're being left behind by design. They're being left behind. And I think that's part of where the conversation, I think, has to start, and where folks that are coming in to invest, all these outside folks, need to somehow be held accountable to the structural violence and oppression that happened for generations before they got there.
Right.
You know what I mean? And they can't, because they can't just see it as this, oh, look at this amazing opportunity. Like, I remember reading in Highland Park this one article from the Times that were talking about how these white young hipster couples were really excited about moving into the Highland Park area, because they felt like, now my kids are going to go to the same school as these immigrant children's kids. And some of them are undocumented. You know, some of the parents really, they don't know how to fully or empowered enough to navigate in these PTA meetings and everything. But we can come in now and almost act like little missionaries to save them. We can now use our voice, and we can advocate and do things that are going to benefit both our kids. But again, I think in that framework, the question should be, as those residents are coming in, how come this community hasn't been served? How come they haven't been empowered? And why are we waiting to do this now that the community's finally changing? Because the gentrification process, as much as folks don't want to talk about it, it's a very racialized project. We're talking about whiteification. You know, because most areas, that's where that capital's coming in. Yes, there's gentrification, where you have third, fourth, and fifth generation Latinos, Mexican Americans that are buying areas of Boyle Heights and some of the
Right.
East LA areas. But for the most part,
Mhm.
across the United States, you're talking about whiteification.
Right.
And I think it's when I guess for me, when we start the conversation there, then maybe we could try to elevate it to a systematic, to a systems analysis as well.
Yeah.
Because one hand is washing the other. White supremacy, colonialism, and all that is actually some of the ideological kind of like foundations that are then being at play when they look at these areas and they act like the community and the residents are uncivilized or never had the potential to grow or develop, right? So yeah, I think what you're talking about is this idea that where do communities and where do folks need to be on the front end of investing in community, establishing some protocols, some rules, some policies that make it so that folks can come in and straight up just start gobbling and starting to buy areas.
Yeah.
And it's been happening. It's only till most recently, I think in LA, rest in peace, Nipsey Hussle, where I think Nipsey started that conversation along with they're calling the, the Crenshaw corridor, or, they were trying to some bullshit on renaming the, Lemire Park because of the light rail that's going down Crenshaw Boulevard. To hit Century and then make a right, go by the new NFL stadium, and then end up at LAX. But they were having that conversation. And I think Nipsey, at his moment, at his peak, was showing up to community meetings saying, hell no, we're not going to change the name of Lemire Park. Because that's part of our identity. That's an acknowledgement that this was the black neighborhood. And then if you do your history, then you'll know about redlining, restrictive covenants, that it wasn't that the black community could ever choose where they wanted to live. They were forced to where they were going to live.
Yeah, and how you mentioned before, like how highways kind of delineate lines of where communities can be. Like if people lived on east or west or north and south of a specific freeway, a stretch of freeway. And I've learned, outside of LA, like in the Austin area, a portion of a route that would go around the city, they would push people of color further away from the city and keep white communities within that kind of circle of a highway that would go around all the Austin area, and so like that's kind of the use of like historical, like you said, redlining, and I would say like it's almost like a similar gentrification in a way of like, forcing people into communities where you're not gonna be in this kind of like Levittown situation,
Yeah,
And,
I think part of even like when I think about that, because I have my Ph.D. in education with a specialization in race and ethnicity, and my master's in Chicanx Studies, and then of course doing the youth work as an organized community worker. I also think of like the case studies that folks have made about Chicago when they took down the projects of South Chicago. Gentrification went on steroids in Southside Chicago. Families were forced, and neighborhoods were straight up recut and relined, and folks were being pushed out into different areas. And where did that like tension and everything explode? In schools or in the streets, where neighborhoods where they had gangs and certain identities, and folks from certain areas were then forced to be like basically engage each other in this very forced fashion, where people bring their problems with them, people bring their traumas, but again, people would just think all that crazy where they were calling Chicago Chirac, and they were talking about that gun violence. A lot of like my scholars, friends, homies that do the work, shout out to Dr. David Stovall and his idea of things called social engineering, but really trying to get to this folks that this was structural change that then played out to the streets. And when it hit to the level where they were tearing down neighborhoods, closing down schools, and forcing a migration basically of folks from another area, that just sparked up. It impacted, underground street economies. And it got a bunch of young people to start beefing with other young people on a higher rates because they were forced to, those are conversations that nobody talks about when we talk about gentrification. It's always this very pro-development. It's going to help everybody. It's going to be some kind of like, elevation, right? Like some kind of upliftment out of a depressed state. And it's like, and again, it kind of just reminds me of whiteness. Yeah, that's funny from your perspective, from what you see, that's what you see. But you're not a resident. You're not a family member. You haven't grown up in the neighborhoods that you're talking about and the dynamics that have happened there because of historical neglect and historical structural violence. Because it's been, areas that the drug trade has been there for generations.
Yeah.
Because white folks and other folks said, as long as you do it in this neighborhood and don't do it in ours, go ahead.
Yeah, and that was something that was brought up with Eric Sonata when I did the podcast about affordable housing and and areas, is that when these developers come in and sometimes they come in with like British accents and they don't sound like locals to Alhambra, they don't sound like locals to the San Gabriel Valley, and it's like, why are we and then we start asking the questions, why are you developing these luxury apartments in an area of Alhambra where, and don't get me wrong, Alhambra is great and all, but like one of our only things is just the main street. We don't have like a tourist center. We don't have anything like, like a sports center. We like the closest thing is the Rose Bowl, and that's out in Pasadena.
Right.
So like why is Alhambra being being seen as like a place for these developers and these speculators to build luxury apartments with no affordable housing for communities in the area that work in the restaurants, the teachers that go to the schools, the firefighters, the police officers. Like it's not adding housing stock with the idea that it's going to benefit a community. No, it's like it's adding housing stock because it's a profit sort of situation.
Yeah, no sense or no desire to want to pick something or develop something that the community could need, or that could complete like you said, could create opportunities to fully develop and expand across the board. No, they want access to one little area to get these luxury apartments in, to plant the seed to see if by doing that, could they get an influx of people to come in? And then next you got to build another one. And then you got to build another one.
Yeah.
And then it becomes its whole little area. So, yeah, dude, it totally reminds me of when the Spanish and all these imperial nations, were coming in. They looked at the land, they looked at the people and resources, not for how they could build with them and build on or even learn from them. They came in saying, we want gold. We want these natural resources. That's what we see value in. Yeah. And they came in with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. And I think that today that gets played out where the Bible is this whole like playbook of you're going to get Starbucks. Like the Bible is kind of like this dream or these lies of all this economic development that they sell to you that's going to suddenly uplift and give your community the Trader Joe's. It's going to give your community all these nice things that maybe you've never had before. But then the lie comes with the sword, because when the sword comes in, that's law enforcement. And that's going to be hella policing. And then at some point, you're going to wonder why, as a working class person, even being there, driving home from work late one evening, why you're going to get lit up and sick, and because you fit the description.
Right.
And you're going to be looking at them going, man, I grew up here. This is my home. How could you say that? I'm driving a 4-door Honda sedan or something like that. I'm in my work uniform. I have my dress shirt and my tie loose. What are you talking about? Because I've heard those stories, even from my work on the West Side and downtown. I mean, at some point, as we're seeing in this historical moment about, defunding the police and just looking at law enforcement, the toxicity and the hate of law enforcement, there's a lot of like politics that police have been used strategically to make this process where they're basically trying to sweep folks out, man.
Yeah, even if it's like a security guard of color, like that happened in LA. He's somebody that lives in the community, wants to, and then he gets shot down by a police officer. And so like, where's the justice in that? And as I mentioned before, it's like, why do we have, like, we need to address what went wrong with police, in the sense that what ended up in the definition of the police, where they can be the judge, jury, and an executioner. And when they profile somebody, regardless of their past or what are their current crimes, there is this idea that there is due process and law, and that, you're proven innocent until guilty, and so when this whole George Floyd thing happened, and like people were trying to make judgments of like, oh, about his past, it's like, this past don't matter. His past does not matter. What matters is that he was killed on an assumption. Breonna Taylor was killed on assumption. Ahmaud Arbery was killed on assumption. And it's and if you don't see that that's injustice, then I think the conversation moves forward, and it's like, maybe there's some underlying racism that needs to be addressed.
Oh, yeah, Brian. And if they can't see that that's systematic racism, the fact you could be in different states, different communities, different area, and have that same kind of playbook on that assumption, and having Black Death and having them seen, of course, as the criminal. I mean, a lot of criminologists and sociologists, ethnic studies folks would argue that it's probably the roots of the police in its origins as those slave patrols. I think even those ideologies, those practices have carried over to the fact where Black and brown bodies in particular are always going to be seen as the criminal. It's always going to be seen as subhuman or less of a human being, and never given the benefit of the doubt. Never given like, well, let me double check that. I remember one of my critical race and ethnic studies professors, shout out to Dr. Tyrone Howard, and you said, I remember one of the activities he would just would always ask us like I guess take a situation like this, like with the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, rest in peace, along with all the other, Black lives lost, right? But to like close your eyes and think, now what if those were white women? Or what were those if those were white girls? Trayvon Martin. Imagine if that was a young white girl that got killed like that. Would America, would our society even, where would we be at? And I would always think this whole system would have stopped on a nail if everybody that we were killed were either a white woman or a white girl. So I hope that if somebody hears this podcast, they don't think that I'm playing like the race card. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that rooted in these ideologies and structures, different lives and different human beings in society, these identities have value. And some are seen as disposable and some are seen as criminal. And when you think of a white woman, that's why the whole Karen's movement is so powerful. That their white emotion, their white tears through years of back in history, lynching, an accusation, a look, anything could have gotten Black males killed by even looking at a white woman. And to this day, they could get on a phone and make accusations. The cops are going to come and there's a potential death that could happen. I mean, I think to come back full circle, if folks can't see that it's systematic, that's a big part of where we struggle in this country. It's because that we can't acknowledge and admit that this shit is so ingrained that it's normalized. We kind of think it's just part of policing. We just think you have to racial profile. I remember so much of my youth intervention work saying, so you guys are very upfront that y'all racial profile. Yeah, we have to do that. That's part of and that's where we would always say, no, you don't have to do that. How about you knowing the residents and you knowing the community, so you start to find out who are the folks that are out there that are being hurtful and who are the folks that are out there trying to survive, because there's a difference.
Yeah, and it needs to be recognized. There are issues, and I think there's nobody can be free from fault here. And there's some police precincts that's just like, oh, we're always good. And it's like, no, like just you by saying that we're always good, now we want to, you're saying you're all good. Let's figure that out. Let's investigate, because there's always going to be somebody that's not 100% all right in the head when they're in the force, and that needs to be addressed. If mental health is an issue within police force, we need to meet it at where it is and address those issues, because it's like, if somebody that's not all that there, we need to make sure that they're not there in a community with a gun. They're not there, potentially going to hurt somebody else on assumption, on a racial profile basis, on this idea that they could profile this person and say, oh, that's just a normal gangbanger. You know what I mean? And so that's what I'm hopeful for this now movement of defund the police, or at least police reform. To really, really meet communities at where they're at and say, listen, We want you to represent us, not the other way around, you know.
I think the big challenge in that, because, you know, I'm definitely a transformer. I would love to see, you know, again, kind of us adopt from other country, like a whole other way of practicing and enforcing or enacting law enforcement. But in terms of police reform, because I know how much power and how ingrained it is to in society, I think we definitely need to start there. I think one question we need to raise is why, like in the LAPD, the LA County Sheriffs in particular, they have some of the highest rate of former veterans that are hired on, right? So you have former soldiers that were potentially in Iraq or potentially in Palestine, you know, Afghanistan, experiencing high levels of trauma. And then my question is, how healthy and how is their mental wellness when the credo or what's on the door of these police cars is to protect and serve? But when you're a soldier, you make statements like, I got to do whatever I got to do to get home to my family. And there's a difference in that. You know, and then of course the educational background and the training, you know, to humanize law enforcement, they're very much, none of them have taken, like, very few have ever taken a sociology class. I think I was reading somewhere that it hasn't only been until the last 10 to like 15 years that the LAPD was really trying to recruit a lot more minoritized population, like folks of color, to be law enforcement. At the same time, they were trying to increase folks with a bachelor's degree. Because they started to really figure out that, yes, like, it's good to have some well-rounded folks that have been exposed to different ideas and different views out in our communities doing this work. But I would even say, like, even then, that's not enough. You know, right here in Denver, they're really pushing to have social workers on call riding with these officers so that when they hit certain situations and cases, that a social worker can also be a part of conflict resolution or kind of figuring out, assessing the situation. And the sad part is that most law enforcement are like basically, who are you? Why would you roll with, you know, why would you even roll with me? And why would you even have any opinion or any influence how I do my job? And all that power kind of consolidate, you know, all that, like I said, that goes probably back to the history of slave patrols and the history that policing has served a function in maintaining racism and white supremacy. That there is a supremacy in there of, when I put on that uniform or whatever, I have the power, you don't. And it goes to folks' head, man. And, you know, and it takes folks to lose, like in this moment, it's taken folks to be on video for the last 7 to 10 years, seeing death, a black death on video by police. And then you have to do the pandemic. And then you have to do the current political, you know, with FDT in office, and it took a lot of specific, I think, like historical moments and engagement of the public to see some of this stuff to finally get it to where there was a breaking point to get it. But it took a lot, I think, to get there, because like we know from our work, just because folks are talking about it now, they're not recognizing that we've been talking about this 20 plus years. You know, about police reform and the criminalization of youth and criminalization of communities and brutality and all that. Like, we've been talking about that.
It's like it's even though we were saying it, I think not many people were paying attention because maybe they were within that system or were there in that matrix. Like one of my students would always say, it's all about the matrix. But it's that they were living this idea that, well, if it doesn't affect me, then why should I care about it? You know what I mean? And so that's that you know, that psychology of it. It's like that's a big deal in Asian American advocacy. It's like the almost apathy of it. You know, like, we're the model minority, therefore we shouldn't touch it, you know, because it doesn't involve us, you know. Unless it involves us, then it doesn't really matter. And it had to take coronavirus and like this president that keeps on calling it the Chinese virus, and like, you know, like, I get it to some folks, and including some family members of mine. Oh no, he's saying that as a affront to the Chinese Communist government. Okay, sure, you would want to make that argument, but many people in his base don't make that connection. Many people that want to get an excuse to racially profile Asians don't get that. And that's what I'm afraid of. That's what him calling it the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu, the Chinese virus, that's the thing that I don't like. And it already has a name already. It already has COVID-19. The fact that he says it in those racialized terms means that it gives his base, regardless of what he tried to make it initially mean on a governmental or on a national stage, it affects me.
Yes.
And when I'm always compared as, oh, like when I say I'm Cambodian and people say, oh, what's is that a state in China? It's like when people are continuously saying that, when white America is completely keep on saying that I'm Chinese, I'm still afraid.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, and
as an Asian American,
and the same thing with the like within the Chicano Latino community too, where we have this diaspora of folks, but for the most part, if you're brown, the first thing you're going to think is they're Mexican, and they could be Salvadoreño. Yeah, no, and that's a lot of it is that naming and that power that whiteness likes to do is to try to group everybody in this homogenous group, because then it offers an opportunity to control. Mm-hmm. But I think Bryan, you're hitting it right on the nose. That one big takeaway of this historical moment is seeing an increase of violence and racial profiling and targeting of Asian and Asian American and Southeast Asian folks in this country because of that rhetoric. Yeah. So like one thing is for some folks to even recognize that, oh yeah, well, he might have double meanings, but you're right. His base will take that and use this as an excuse to then enact violence. Mm-hmm. So do words matter? Yes. Do verbal assaults and microaggressions like that happen? Does it matter? Yes. Because all that drives a base that is looking for any opportunity. You know, if we look at what happened at the University of Virginia, and we look about all those white nationalists that are coming out that are prepping, mm-hmm. those are the folks that hear stuff like that are going to want to go out and look for folk, you know. Yeah. And I think it's a reality though that like that definitely not a part of the public discourse a lot mm-hmm. about the targeting and stuff that COVID, mm-hmm. as much as the public health crisis has also led to targeting certain groups. Yeah. And the Asian American, Asian community is that group. Yeah.
And going back to a little bit about police brutality and like and now just recently the body cam footage just came out about you know, so some of the officers that were like that are currently in prison right now or in jail. Well, one of them being Tao, the Chinese, not George Chinese Floyd. American, yeah, the Hmong American, right? And yep. and just my thing about that is like there is this model minority that likes that values the, you know, authoritarian, you know, like the rules based things in society. And like Tao doesn't represent all of Asian Americans, you know, like he does not represent like what we do, what we value in a community. And like and I'm seeing like there is kind of like this racialized idea that, oh, like because he do it, now we have to question all Asian Americans and like their complicity in this whole George Floyd thing. And to some degree, I think for me personally, so when I bring up George Floyd and these examples of police brutalities in communities of color, I'm starting to be more hyper aware of my Asianness, you know, like as someone that grew up in a model minority myth, it's like, do I okay it, you know, like, but just by the aspect of being in an Asian American community, you know, and like and seeing what he did and what he just stood behind, you know, like he didn't say anything, he didn't stand up, he didn't say, hey man, that's messed up, you got to get off of him, you know. By him not saying anything, that's almost a representation of a model minority. Yeah, he's not saying anything
given. Yeah, and without being vocal and not using your voice and kind of calling it out. Yeah, mm-hmm. That's where they get to that whole notion that silence is violence. Yeah, because in your silence you're giving consent.
Yeah, you know? and with me, like having conversation with my coworkers, having conversations with people on my podcast, is that I want to try to see and address is like, what can I do as an ally? Like I'm instead of me going out and marching, you know, and doing those things, I want to be more introspective and like I want to address how can I meet this moment and communicate with elders in my communities, you know, like my family, you know, like, you know, there's this documentary, now it's free, from National Geographic. They did like a LA 92. They talk about you know, the LA riots of that time, but the one big takeaway is that they make a connection between the LA riots of 92 and then the social unrest of the Watts riots back in the 50s and the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And they make that connection saying like, unless we address it and meet it at where it's at, it's going to continue and it's going to be a cycle, and it's going to be a cycle. And I talked about this before. It's like, it's going to be a cycle of like event, protests, nothing happens, and then it really starts over again where there's another event in history, and then there's protests and nothing happens. So what can we do to break that chain of saying like, there's an event, we meet it where it's at, and we need to address it to move forward so we don't make that same mistake again?
Yeah, no, I would say that like part of it is and I would kind of problematize or a little bit like that whole like cycle, like, because I dig it. You know, it takes an event that's going to spark, almost like that spark that's going to hit it's going to ignite the social flames, literally, of communities to go up and uprise. Then I think what happens is some moderate, at times, changes happen. Because, you know, from 92, you know, Magic Johnson, some of these other investors started to put some kind of things that the community had been waiting for years, like markets, like, you know, what was it, like Starbucks came, like all these little TGI Fridays, you know, all these things that residents were saying that we wanted to have in our community. They got a bit of that. But then what also happened was, again, increased law enforcement, mass incarceration, gang injunctions, and then gentrification. So, right, yeah, like then it gets all sucked in to the system. I think it's our work is really about, I think, movement building with the idea that we need to really start to push for a political education in our communities, and even just looking at our schools all around the board, that we've got to start empowering people on the front end with these lenses and the ability to name oppression, historicize it, understand their community, read the world around them, so that they can then transform the world that they see. Kind of, you know, a shout out to Paulo Freire. You know, I think what it is in our communities, the way to break that cycle is we need more of our youth and our community folks to be able to read and see these systems and see the history and see these institutions for what they are and their oppression. And once we can name it, then we can start to critically think on how to challenge them and change them. If we're still reading the ground and we still can't name these processes like gentrification, white supremacy, you know, colonization, like if we still can't unpack some of that stuff, then I think these systems will just keep happening in a cycle because no one's knowing that they're a cycle.
Or it's just kind of been pushed to the side, because if it's like in a community where it values doing the hustle and getting somewhere, and so sometimes that social component or the social justice component is not up in the upfront in some of those cultures or communities, you know, and that's something that I think my family hasn't really realized, you know. It's like, and I guess part of it, and we mentioned this before in our pre-interview, it has to take somebody within their own culture, or like they have to look like us for them to say something, you know. It has to be and it has to be, for me in my case, it has to be a Cambodian activist to say like, oh, there's a problem in the community, we need to meet it, we need to address it. But like and for that Cambodian activist to say, you know, this is not just a Cambodian issue. This is like a community. This is, if you live in LA, if you live in Long Beach, this is something that is on a broader scale, and it's not just, you know, I'm here to help the Cambodian community, but you know, like if we make it, we got to help others, you know. And so
I totally agree, Brian. Yeah, we had talked about pre-interview, because that's where representation matters, and for our communities too. That's where some of the trust is going to be given. You know, I remember being a young activist, like, you know, really having that transformative experience with Chicanx Studies and ethnic studies. I think it actually took root, and it really kind of grew, because it was the first time in my life that I saw another like Chicano male professor that was talking to me about my history, my culture, was breaking down different things that I've lived or that my family have experienced, like being a migrant farm worker, you know, encountering gun violence, poverty, you know, feeling racism, you know, and racial slurs and everything like that. Those things, you know, but if it was like, say, a really ally, you know, activist white professor, I don't know if at that time I would have maybe made all those connections.
Right.
But because it was someone that looked like me and I felt could identify, it like kind of, it took a lot of that implicit bias or prejudgment away to where I could actually tune in. So I totally agree. But I think that's where then that responsibility comes, is you meet folks where they're at, but then you're saying, okay, now we got to connect it, because this is a systematic thing. This is systemic. What's happening here is happening to our Latino brothers and sisters. You know, they're happening to our LGBTQ, trans folks, you know, queer folks, you know, undocu folks. You know, these systems have no love or respect for human life or humanity at its core.
Right.
You know, it's profit over people. It's profit over the environment. It's to take power by any means necessary. And I think, yeah, you're right, though. I think a lot of the work that we need to be doing, you know, as we were talking a little bit too about the pandemic, is to now start maybe having those courageous and hard conversations with our family about some of those views, just so that maybe the younger ones or they know that there's an alternative perspective out there, that it doesn't have to be one way. To be Cambodian American or to be a Cambodian immigrant or migrant background does not mean that as a model minority might state, that it's about just kind of like, you know, putting their head down and just being very one-track mind and really just try to focus on, you know, economic development or building a family or, you know, all those things, but that you don't exist in a vacuum. That you are a member of the broader community. And what does that look like? You know, but if no one's sharing that with you and empowering you to see it like that, then you'll very much we'll all just kind of get back into our little modes of just kind of normalizing things and, you know.
That's the thing about like making connections that like on a personal level, like, as a Cambodian American, and I'm not just trying to call out family, but like I've seen this in the Cambodian community as a whole, you know, that, you know, like politics back home really resonate with the Cambodian community. And I don't know how much it does for other communities, but if I'm trying to make connections about, say, George Floyd or say police brutality, then I have to take that extra step of following politics in Cambodia and say, well, that same thing is happening in Cambodia, where you have a corrupt government set up and military police coming into communities and like really brutalizing the local areas, destroying national forests, doing all of these things, and you're calling it out, right? You're rightfully calling it out. But if it's happening here in the States and your kids have to deal with that, and you're not calling it out, then, you know, where's the logic in that, you know? And I'm not trying to say full tilt, don't care about politics in Cambodia, but like those all should matter. You know, if I care about democracy somewhere else, say in Hong Kong or say in Cambodia, right, that should matter here too. Making sure that people have a way to vote safely, to make sure that individuals and people in the community can vote, because, you know, there are screwed up ID laws about voting, or the whole Stacey Abrams thing that happened in Georgia and during her election, you know, like almost thousands of people to one ballot location, you know, like that's voter suppression, you know,
right? So, straight up overt voter repression.
And so making those connections and saying like, you know, hey, you know, we see this happening in Cambodia, but we can also see this happening here. And not to say that, you know, to disavow like, oh, America is not the best country or anything like that. But, you know, with all its faults, we can call out the bullshit for what it is and address those problems. Because if we make this conversation that says, oh, the U.S. can do no wrong, then it allows people to take that messaging, to take that and say, oh, if we can do no wrong, then, oh, let's turn the dial so individual freedoms go away, or turn the dial where you could get racially profiled by someone that works in the community, or your voter gets suppressed by these by these ways that you can see, they're not hiding in the dark anymore now, and it's out in the open.
Yeah, no, and just hearing like that, like recognition, like really at the core too, that kind of like, where there needs to be a sense of this interconnected part of our existence, that some folks in some areas, whether it's locally or within the state or even abroad, are being oppressed, that at some measure of urgency or acknowledgement needs to also happen in our part. Mm-hmm. Because, like they'll say in organizing, like we have to have a sense of shared liberation. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be free unless you're free. Vice versa. You're not going to be free unless I'm free. And I remember with like, kind of on a more microcosm or community level, looking at areas like when I was working with the Black Panther Mentorship Project and looking at, the diversity of right there in the, mid-city downtown area, Salvadoreños, Mexicanos, Hondureños, Belize, and then you had all the Korean communities and the diasporas within the Korean community that were there too. Right. And small pockets of Vietnamese, Southeast Asian folks all there. And I remember, the young folks kind of coming in saying, like, I don't know if I knocked on the door if one of my neighbors would want to open up the door and talk to me. And I remember a lot of where we thought that's why we wanted to look to some of the indigenous teachings, ancestral knowledge, one from like the Mayans and is also prevalent across different ancient civilizations, is this idea of en la quech, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me, which is this idea that like, like Ubuntu in Africa, I am me, I am because you are, right? That I think at some point there needs to be that level of acknowledgement and teachings that can say that, you know what, I might be good, I might be in a certain thing, but my existence of being good is also interconnected or relates to folks that might be struggling. And, I think it'll be a paradigm shift. I think it's part of the work. I think when folks ask me, hey, Johnny Rocket, what would you say if I was going into community? What would you say is one of the things to look for? And I always kind of come back that as one of the first core values is you can't look at folks as the other. You can't look at folks being deficit and being less than you or misinformed or da-da-da. You need to look at those folks as being connected to you and how can you meet them where they're at so that y'all can build together.
It's like I feel like it's like bringing the humanity into it, and it's not an us versus them. It's like if you live in these communities, if you want to address the issues in certain ways, it has to be constructive. It has to be a both give and take, and something that I've ranted and raved about with my friends is that like bringing new or bringing in solutions to the table versus rhetoric. And like as much as I can be very hard on the Republican Party, like there is a lot of like problems and issues when on the Democratic Party when all I'm hearing is vote me because I'm not Trump.
Yes.
And they're not bringing solutions to the tables when all I want somebody to say, this is my plan. This is what I want to do. This is how I want to do it versus, oh, he screwed up coronavirus, therefore vote for me.
Yeah. No, Brian. And some of the stuff that I caught too and listening to the DNC was like Kamala Harris saying, I want to champion working families, middle-class families. I want to offer these big tax breaks, like all this stuff. And for me, what I felt was missing was the acknowledgement that Bernie, AOC, that it's been a progressive, very anti-Democratic Party establishment folks. These voices of dissent that now these folks are going to cherry pick and use to try to like say that they're going to do it. But has it really been originally a part of their platform? Has it really been issues that they really want to champion? I mean, I would say no. And if we didn't have those few voices of dissent that basically, that Bernie, to show how much folks were supporting him and AOC as well, then who knows if we would even be having this conversation of potential maybe student loan forgiveness or some kind of subsidy for that. I mean, I think that's where the Democratic Party's already lost it. Is they're so establishment, it's so institutionalized. I mean, me personally, I just think it's time for a third party. Yeah. Like, I think it's just time for, because all those issues that Bernie, the Green New Deal and everything, all the push for student loan reimbursement, everything, you've got a radical class of white activists now in particular that are riding with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got folks of us of color that have gone through and experienced some of that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
poverty, you know, the need for rent control, like all this stuff, so that we can have a living wage and we can provide for our families. We've been saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think both of those parties don't even acknowledge the importance of that. And then we haven't even talked about the environment.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm thinking we're prime, and we've been due for a long time to create more of a people party, or more of a, you know, this is going to be a people over profit party.
Yeah, and
You know?
within the Democratic Party, and now we're getting into our little political debate.
Yeah.
But like, there is this kind of shift of like, well, you know, people that look like ourselves in the community going into a senator position, going into a congressman position. You know, you have that Cori Bush of like, you know, she works in a community, had coronavirus twice, you know, and is an elected official. And this is somebody that knows what it feels like to be evicted. This is somebody that understands, you know, like what it means to not know where your next paycheck is coming from, you know.
Right.
And like that's the same thing with AOC, you know, worked as a bartender, you know, like hustled throughout life, you know. And what I'm seeing right now is that there are a good contingent of people that are not just a corporate Democratic, you know,
Right.
establishment, you know,
Right.
that's not, you know, that's more indicative of a community versus, oh, my donor gave me this amount of money, therefore I have to do X amount of things, you know.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's just more of like, again, it's there's a movement brewing of another generation, or a lot of young voters that are basically saying enough is enough. Like, we're sick of the lies, we're sick of basically the bullshit and kind of business as usual politics with the Democratic Party. I just get cautious that every time these elections come up and you tell these young people, just vote for us because at least that ain't Trump. All that does is start to deflate the power that they really have to say, no, we can reimagine and we can envision something new, and let's do it. Because any kind of progressive or any kind of change has always started with some kind of vision, where when you would tell folks back in the days, you know, at some point, do you think we'd ever have a black president? There had to be generations that are going, hell no, because I could get lynched and killed if I stayed beyond sundowner laws. Right. You know, there was levels to this shit of where people couldn't even imagine, our ancestors at times couldn't even imagine where we'd be at right now. But if we keep on settling, and if we keep on kind of conforming, we're going to lose that energy. We're going to lose that spirit to want something more than what the system's willing to give. And that's where I feel like we can't. It's like one of those things. I don't want our young folks to sell their soul. I don't want our young folks to sell their spirit away just because the establishment is saying, oh no, we've got to play politics this way or else we're going to lose. Yeah. But then nobody wants to talk about at that table, say Trump does get reelected and the shit gets worse. Dude, the pandemic has showed us that we could shut shit down. The state can shut shit down. Well, you know what? In other countries, like on International Workers' Day, the people can shut shit down too. They can block freeways. Truck drivers can stop driving. Like, shit could happen, you know? But because we don't have that history, I don't think we see it. It's hard for that, like, vision to manifest. But yeah, man, I think you're totally right. I think the read right now is vote for us because we're not Trump. And I think for these youngsters, I think our youth and a lot of folks from our community, like you're saying, then you know what? We need more than that. Because right now with the pandemic, it's all just totally bringing to light and really elevating those disparities that we live daily.
True. And it's like one of the conversations I had with a friend is that why is it that we during the pandemic, during incredible like crazy historical events such as this, right? And your employment is tied, your healthcare is tied to your employment. You know, you can't go back to work. You can't do the things that like, and if you get coronavirus, you get stuck with almost $250,000 bill, you know? And so it's trying, like what I see with AOC, what I see with Bernie Sanders, and to some degree what I also saw with Andrew Yang is that there were people effectively trying to bring things to the table and say we need to address this moment where it's at and have solutions and have people come up with new ways of thinking, new ideas on the economy, new ideas within healthcare, better solutions on environment and on energy, and so that's the conversation I had. And to your point earlier about having leaders that look like us, having political leaders in the forefront that look like you and me. I remember when Obama got elected, right? And I said, you know what? I'm going to write this on Facebook. Just like, so Obama got elected. Do you think in 8 years we can see an Asian American coming into the fold, being a political leader, doing those things? And a lot of people said on that Facebook post in like 2009, 2008, saying like, nah, that's never going to happen. And I just thought, what? That's kind of screwed up, as much as Andrew Yang could be, not the 100% best person for the job. It's like he was a candidate. He was somebody that was breaking down that barrier of like that bamboo ceiling of that. Oh, Asian Americans can be candidates for president. They can do those things, So yeah, sorry, that was my rant. And also
No.
I come from a little bit of background. I was very excited about the Yang Gang and the idea that I was coming from the frame of my community and at least in the Alhambra areas that, if economic issues are a big deal in the San Gabriel Valley, why couldn't a UBI be something that can liberate people from like not worrying where the next paycheck's gonna come from, making sure their rent needs are met, making sure the quality of life and things are better. That's why I was very excited about Yang. But there was just so many people that were on that Democratic candidates list, and now we're just kind of Biden and Harris, and I'm just kind of cautiously, I wouldn't say optimistic, but just kind of skeptical of it. Just I'm skeptical that if for the people that wanted to call for Black lives, we now have a vice president that's like pro police.
Yes.
Her history of what she did in California, and
criminalized parents and arrested quote unquote truants, and was willing to be a component in what we know is a school to prison pipeline. Yes.
Yeah.
And has she ever really reconciled that? Has she ever said, yes, I felt that that there needed to be more accountability for parents and for these young people, blah blah blah? But then has she ever publicly said, but unfortunately, this strategy fed into the school to prison pipeline. Like as this is we thought it was an effective strategy. It was, used as a tool to feed into this system of mass incarceration. She hasn't said that. So for me as an activist, I struggle with that.
Yeah.
To be like, hey, on this issue, maybe you did the best in terms of problem solving and being in leadership, thinking that you did the best to get the result you wanted. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't an impact because of that.
Yeah. And then upholding like wrongful convictions, like when new evidence came about during a conviction or during a murder trial that exonerated the people on her watch. She tried to stick with those convictions, and like with a benefit of the doubt, like if you're a Kamala Harris loyalist or whatever, right? If you really felt strongly about her, well. And if she really did change her mind, where is her statement where she said what you just said? It's like, I saw my mistake, and I want to correct those and like meet communities where they're at. That hasn't happened yet, and with this current moment with, like we said earlier, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, like, is she the right vice president to address those issues? And I know there was so much talk about getting a person of color and getting a woman onto the vice president thing, but I was just thinking, to try to get more progressives or get more people in that voting area, I think I could have just chose somebody else than Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I would have to say, just based on her record, that like, yes, as someone that's, been a youth worker, I've worked with youth that the system has labeled as troubled or, dropouts, like in California, like she was definitely feeding into the school to prison pipeline. So with no kind of accountability to that, I'm thinking if she doesn't continue to perpetuate mass incarceration here, I'm also keen enough to know that she could also be a part of spreading mass incarceration globally.
Yeah.
That she would end up being a consultant and end up sharing the strategies that she used in California. And then next thing you know, like, you know, our vice president's on a tour that's talking about how, how the state can better educate or blah, blah, blah. But at the core of it is perpetuating mass incarceration prison industrial complex. I can't move forward with any sense of trust that in her leadership capacity that she's not going to side with the state. I think her decision record has showed me with those conviction that you brought up a powerful point about like her in the conviction rates and not not conceding or adhering that some of those were wrong. No, she stood with the DA, she stood with the state. So how progressive are you going to be when the voices of dissent like Bernie and AOC are all challenging the state or the status quo? Yeah, I think there could have been someone else that they could have picked. I think it's hard, like, because in my mind, I was still thinking of any real, like, connected to community, and my issues was definitely the Bernie ticket. And, it just, oh, man, it gets so messy and it gets so blurry on where do we want to go in this historical moment with recognizing that Trump's there. But sometimes, and again, this is speaking probably even from a moment of even privilege, I would say, for some of my identities as having my degree now, as a Ph.D., a hetero Chicano male, I'm sure there's privileges I carry, no doubt. But I also think that one of the old school organizing kind of perspectives that we used to run on is sometimes the best organizer is a bad boss. And, but the reality in saying that, though, is that people are losing lives. Our babies are locked in cages. I mean, there's real shit going on. They're trying to defund the Postal Service. I mean, real impact is happening. So I don't want that statement just to be like, oh, that's easy for Johnny to say. But could we say that along with the pandemic and everything that went down with losing George Floyd, Trump being in office is also a drive. I think a lot of those white youth that are getting crazy in Portland and in Oregon that are fucking going off, they're going off because of Trump too. And it's driving some of it.
Yeah. And it's not a complete and I guess indictment on the Democratic Party, but it's just my frustration where I'm coming from is that it's rhetoric over substance, and it's not meeting communities at where they're at. It's not like if we don't like Trump, then let's bring better ideas to the table to address all the bad that he's done, And so and this is what we got, a Biden-Harris situation.
Yeah, and again, like universal health care, again, figuring out what we're going to do with like the whole gig economy. Like you're right, there's so many issues that they could take a stand on. But see, that's what I think that's where a bit of that coward, a bit of that them wanting not to show their cards or maybe get too specific, because these folks are still trying to wave over the Republicans that are real moderate that don't like Trump, and trying to even wave some of them over to be like, well, you know what? Either you're going to vote for that or you're going to vote for this. And really, that's a sad testament to where it's at. That we can't even talk about visioning and talking about hardcore or I would say not even hardcore, just very explicit solutions. Like, let's get on this student loan forgiveness. Like, let's get on retrofitting and going green technology to spark another generation of development and, kind of like post-World War II. Let's retrofit these houses. Let's train folks. Like, let's do it. But you can't have that conversation, because then when you do, or at least what they're thinking is you do, then it sways people to go back to Trump.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, yo, this is what we're telling our young people? Like, in particular, the young vote? I'm like, no wonder they're just done with it. No wonder a lot of Bernie supporters are like, fuck the vote. You're asking me to vote for two evils, but morally, I feel like I can't vote because they're both fucking us over. It's rough, bro.
Yeah.
It's going to be a rough one right now.
It's going to be it's rough, and it's going to be an interesting 2020. And
yes. That's where I'm going with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you got Angela Davis, a revolutionary Black Panther liberation vote, that's saying straight up already that they're voting for the Biden Kamala ticket. Because in this movement work, there's a belief that, you know, you're dealing with systems and institutions. So if you feel like you can get some people there that are going to be behind the wheel that can be pressured to make some of those changes, then you've got to put them in there, because what we've got right now doesn't make sense. That's like banging your head against the wall thinking he's ever going to do anything around justice or anything. So you put other folks in there that might give an opportunity for that. But again, that's Angela Davis saying that after years. She's older now. She's been a freedom fighter. I'm sure there comes a point where, as elders, you'll see it from that perspective. As someone that works with youth and empowerment, no, part of the biggest, in Angela Davis in her youth was explicitly calling out the system, naming it, and then imagining and wanting to transform it and transformative justice. So it's like, how do you kind of maybe bridge some of those two together? And that's where I think I was going with the whole third party stuff. I don't know how that could happen, but a final break into a new kind of a new organization or a new space where you can have a values statement again. You can revision and reimagine again and learn from the Democratic Party.
Yeah. You know what? You know what this means? It's Johnny Carlos Remirez for California.
Oh, that's funny, Bryan. I've had so much familia that at one point they're going to be like, you're going to be a mayor. Like, you're going to, like, you know how to make relationships with people. You know how to, like, bring folks and their issues together. And I just think, hey, wherever the community would call me to do, I'd be down to do. But I know in terms of democracy, I know that the best way to ever have governance and ever have leadership would be at a local level, where every day I would walk and face and be living alongside my constituents, my residents, because I think that's what holds us accountable. I think the farther you go away from it, I think it can get blurry.
I do agree with that. And for those that are in my audience that say like, oh, I'm not going to vote, and let me make this clear. You're voting not just on a national level, but you're also going to be voting on a local level.
Right.
Things that, and I mentioned this before, and I've gotten varying different degrees of reactions to it, like saying, you know, the national level is important and, like, you know, the local level is more important. But here's where I stand. Vote regardless. Things that happen to you on a daily basis, things that happen to you, you know, whether your rates of water can go up, or you know, you can jive with the sheriff in your area. Like, those votes do matter, and you need, as a citizen, to vote, because sometimes those situations go uncontested, or, you know, people just don't vote in those areas. And I'm willing to get annoyed by physical mail from candidates, because you know what that means? That's a reflection that they say my vote matters.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Bryan, and I would only add to that, like, yes, I know that voting is one small part of making a democracy work. And I'm with those activists that kind of think that, you know, they're really, where's the power that ever came out of the ballot? But I'll tell you this, though, that voting and putting folks in there, think about your grandparents. Think about if they're getting Social Security or SSI. You know, think about, like, our educational system. Think about the cuts and everything that's happened. Believe me, it can get worse, because we've seen it get worse. If you would have asked about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, or let's do a round number 10 years ago, that we would have ICE, and that ICE would have these detention centers with separated families and babies, I would be like, okay, shit's fucked up in the United States. We're locking up folks, but really locking up babies and and kind of pulling them away from their mom or their dad or their grandma, like, shit, that's pretty raw. You know what I mean? Like, I would have to question it. But that's the reality we live in right now because of the Trump president. So, you know, I would tell people, like, yeah, you vote, but the vote is the first step. The second step is to get active, to plug into the Asian Youth Center, to plug into your organization, to get with community groups that are standing on issues of social justice, and find your way. It might take a bit to find your community and to find those issues you need to plug into, but we definitely need to be way more active using our voice and resources to challenge things. Because we can't wait for the George Floyd. Like, we can't wait for these moments of, like, almost like the perfect storm, and then boom, social uprising and upheaval. The power to break that cycle, like going back, is to educate ourselves, to be active, and to be exercising our power constantly. So that's movement building, educating, critically reflecting, what do we do good on this project? What do we need more work on? And be radically inclusive.
Yeah.
Be looking for if we're sitting in a circle and we don't see undocu folks, we don't see trans folks, we don't see native folks, we don't see other white folks, even accomplished white folks, well, we'll play that one by ear. But when we don't see those folks at the table, are we really working towards liberation?
Mm-hmm.
I think what the movement's telling us now is we have to be very intersectional and transformative about our work.
Right.
We really do. We need to get as many folks to coalition build as possible, and we need to go in.
All right. Well, I think we brought up a lot of things, and I think we could even go hours on end. I think with the conversation we have right now, I feel there's probably things that we miss. Things you mentioned. White investment into these communities of color and things like that. For me and where I live in the San Gabriel Valley, it's like foreign investment, like whenever gentrification comes up in the San Gabriel Valley, it's different from the gentrification they're feeling in the LA area, the downtown area, the Highland Park area, and so I think I feel like there has to be some kind of part two, at some future date, or maybe we could have like a panel where we address these issues. So.
Definitely. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you for thinking of me, bro. I mean, this just takes us back to all of our dope conversations that we used to have at LA, bro. We always were able to chop it up. And what I've always appreciated about you, Bryan, is that you embrace those parts of your identity. You've embraced like your family background, the dynamics, that maybe in activist spaces, some folks would kind of be like, oh, really? Like, oh, they're into business, or they're more traditional, or they're more conservative. I've always appreciated that you've embraced that as part of your experience, but that you have continued to grow, that you've taken that and you understand where they're at, but that you've continued on a path towards increasing your knowledge and awareness, and even doing this podcast saying, I have a voice and we have this moment. So how can I be a part of creating these conversations? And, could this be, even if this is all a preparation warm up to something that even becomes bigger, where you're training young folks to do it or bringing more community in, where this becomes a tool. I want to give you props and shout outs on that, man. Definitely. And I guess, and then one last note, if I could ask a favor, could you make me a co-host? Cause I want to acknowledge one of the young people that I recently lost this week.
Okay.
If you don't
go
mind,
ahead.
on Zoom. I'm not sure if you know how to do it on participants. If you could make me a co-host. So if you click participants, and then you'll see my name, there'll be a mic and there'll be a little video button. If you put the cursor over my name, it says more.
Yeah.
And then on more, it might say make a co-host.
It says make host.
Yeah. Could you make me a host real quick?
Yeah. Okay. I'll make you a host real quick. All right.
Okay, cool. And then I want to share my screen real quick, if you don't mind. I have a picture of them, and so yeah, I just want to take a moment to honor one of my first mentees that I worked with, Danny Avila, aka Dank. I used to call him Little Danky. I met him when he was 14 years old. He was an amazing artist. We worked together at the Pico Youth and Family Center in the west side of LA. He was one of those young people that at an early age in third grade, he had a third grade teacher that was teaching him about Malcolm X and ethnic studies and hip hop. And he taught him how to write a poem that rhymed, like basically how to write a verse. And ever since then, from third grade on, he was writing hip hop music and doing graffiti and just totally embracing hip hop culture. And we lost him. He struggled with mental health, and he struggled trying to heal from drug addiction. He was a father of a daughter, Valentina, and he was the youngest son of his mom right here, La Señora Fanny, and the younger brother to Freddie Avila and Mercy Avila. And I just wanted to take a moment to honor his life and legacy. I think at 44 years old, I've been in this work, and you still get a heavy heart and you still get a heavy spirit when some of our young folks are on that journey to find themselves still and to heal. But one thing about Danny is I knew that he had that consciousness. He had that awareness. I think sometimes when our young people have it, though, it's hard. It gets heavy. And maybe even sometimes they run from that responsibility. They run from that leadership or that thing that kind of happens when you know what is right, but you're not willing to commit yourself to making those decisions to do it. Right. So I just want to, send him off in the spirit world. He's with our ancestors. He's with our guardian angel. And I was just blessed to be his mentor, man, to be his big bro, and, just love him very much. So thank you, Bryan, for allowing me to take a moment to honor his life and legacy. Shout outs to any of the listeners from Triple JLA, that worked with Danny with us, with the Youth Leadership Fellows. Shout outs to Li'i Furumoto, for being my friend, my revolutionary, colleague and sister in the struggle, for creating this opportunity so that he could have a job when he became a father and to be able to work with youth. And I think it forever impacted his life. He knew that when it would be time to change and for him to find sobriety, he knew where he could go to start a new part of his life. I think it was just him needing more healing, like him just struggling and being a little bit lost, So yeah, Bryan, I just wanted to kind of end on that note, just to give him a shout out so that, his family and the community know that we're thinking about them too. Thank you, bro.
Yeah, thank you. That's probably like a little moment right now of like a silence, just remembering. All right. Thank you, Johnny.